Well, internationalists of all types seem to love mountains. Many of them like to climb them, they like to hike them, they set events in mountain regions, the Alps in particular, they painted them, they photographed them, they invented them in a way as a preferred site. They ate mountain foods. They made up some of them, like the fondue that I have in the cover of my book. They enjoyed mountain music, and they label certain music in mountain music. And I was really struck by these elements. And in the book, then I decided really to historicize this and to see how we could actually go back and see how different groups were able to take all the notions of the sublime, right, those 19th century version of the sublime attached to the mountains, and then retranslate them after the First World War by really showing mountains as a site for noble endeavors and to adapt them then to their own internationalist causes, whatever this may be.
Hello and welcome to The Next Page, the podcast of the Library and Archives dedicated to advancing the conversation on multilateralism. I'm Amy Smith, and our guest today is Dr. Ilaria Scaglia. She's an author and historian who currently holds the post of Senior Lecturer in Modern History at Aston University in Birmingham, UK. She knows our archives very, very well, as she has a particular interest in the field of the history of internationalism. She also researches the history of emotions. Dr. Scaglia brings these two fields together in her recent book, The Emotions of Internationalism, Feeling International Cooperation in the Alps in the Interwar Period. Ilaria, your book is a delight to read, and I thank you so much for joining us today to talk about it. Before we delve further into your enlightening book, would you please say a few words to our listeners about your own international academic journey and what sparked your personal interest in these fields?
First of all, good afternoon, and thank you so much for having me. So my history in internationalism, I think, matured during my own doctorate, though looking retrospectively, really, it originated from my own journey, studying abroad in China at the beginning, then in the United States, teaching in the United States, and then in Germany and in the UK. And I think because both personally and professionally, I found myself looking outward, outside of Italy, where I was born and raised and began my studies, to find answers to my questions and to fulfill my own goals. Then that journey fueled my interest for people and institutions who did the same thing in the past, and I felt they were close to me. And as for emotions, I think like most, I was raised with the idea that good history is emotional, is distant, and therefore objective. But then my training first dispelled this myth of objectivity. The best we can aspire to is to present and explain well one point of view, though making explicit that point of view, respecting the historical record, accepting its limits. And then this kind of awareness made evident the ubiquitous place of emotions in the past, just as they are in the present. And so I decided to be part of this burgeoning field of historical inquiry to explore them.
So can you explain why there is this growing interest in the study of emotions and why emotions are so important in international history?
Well, most recently, really in the last couple of years, I think various referenda, elections, and so on were explained and rationalized as collective expressions of anger, which is indeed an emotion. And this, I think, made the value of studying emotions, past and present, even more evident to many. But even before then, there were a few currents developing that nurtured this rise of emotions, and I was already part of that earlier chapter. And I think the first was kind of the decline of the myth of objectivity that I described earlier. I'm thinking about the landmark work by The Noble Dream by Peter Novick and a whole current that followed that. There was a push to continue the conversation, I think, after the challenge posed by the postmodern turn in history and in other discipline. Is there anything that cannot be explained as a discourse? And so from there, I think, came a growing frustration with the absence of the body, of the senses, of the physicality from historical accounts that then the history of emotions sought to address and fill that void in a way. And then I think there was the rise of the media, particularly visual media, that seemed to communicate feelings across borders and in ways that we hadn't thought about. And so I think emotions became important for people to think about what happened when individuals, institutions, or government met or not, and how they communicated and what effect these dynamics can have. And then when these things became even more evident in very concrete ways, that fueled it even more.
Absolutely. It's really not something we normally talk about, and it's certainly not a topic that has come up on our podcast, for example. So let's turn now towards your book and perhaps start with a definition. What is internationalism? And more specifically, how do you find the internationalists in your book?
So there are many different definitions of internationalism, and there is a beautiful edited volume by Patricia Clavin and Glenda Sluga called Internationalisms with a wonderful array of all different ways. But in my book, I conceptualized it particularly specifically as a practice, as a set of things that people individually or collectively did, and in particular as the practice of reaching out internationally in order to fulfill their objectives and to achieve their goals, regardless of what these goals were. So framed as such, internationalists formed a heterogeneous group in terms of ideology. They didn't get along with one another in terms of what they thought. In the book, I talk about Catholic, communist, fascist, liberal internationalists, who all engaged in similar activities despite their ideological differences. And these activities included organizing international events, for instance. And they often were active in the same places. In my case, I talk about the Alps, and often evoked similar emotions, such as amity, to use a term they like, or friendship, for example. And so that's why I found it helpful to define them as a community of practice rather than to divide them up based on what they thought individually.
This is very interesting. And so you show how the internationalists considered emotions really an essential part of their work, as you're saying. And that there are sort of functions to emotions, how you feel can affect what you do. So your book focuses on these practices of internationalists and the impact of those practices. And in doing so, I think you really beautifully pick out the patterns of emotions that stand out as a sort of bas-relief in the narrative. And of course, this unfolds in the context of the interwar period, and the past horrors of the First World War are very, very vivid in people's minds. What you bring to the fore is the way in which internationalists sought to encourage, manipulate even, specific emotions. So would you tell us what emotions were linked with internationalism? You've mentioned amity and friendship. What others?
Well, you rightly mentioned the First World War, and I think this is particularly important because the story I tell in this book is set at a particular moment, the end of what people at the time called the Great War. When people tried to make sense of it as an unprecedented carnage, and they try to deal with its effects by looking at emotions. And I think it's something we've forgotten since, but it's certainly evident when you start looking at the sources. They dealt, first of all, with an emotional trauma, coining terms such as shell shock, increasing studies of depression, and so on. And crucially, they explained what they went through as the result of what they sometimes called mismanaged passions. Emotions went awry, like excessive pride, resentment. They had all sorts of clusters of terms for this, but they often talked about emotions gone out of hand. That's what led then to the tragedy that they went through. And many saw the only way out, the only path towards recovery and towards then the maintenance of peace as one where emotions would be managed. I thought a lot about that term. Should I use manipulating or managing? They all have a different connotation, but they thought that it would be possible somewhat to play with emotions and contain them in a way. In the case of the League of Nations, one of the dominant notions was that hatred or resentment could and should be prevented. And international friendship or amity or, again, concord, those sorts of terms, could and should be fostered. And they designed then a number of projects accordingly, and they had all sorts of steps that they devised trying to make that happen.
So the book is also about internationalism. And because we're talking about internationalism, we should perhaps also mention nationalism, of which there were also various forms at the time. And I'm sure you will talk about that more later. But to start, how do the emotions that internationalists aim to promulgate compare or contrast with the emotions linked with the rising tide of radical nationalism at the time and different associated ideologies in the interwar period?
Yeah, so first, it is important to note that in the mind of many internationalists, nationalism was not incompatible with internationalism. In fact, they were often the first one to self-identify and to label others as members of a particular nation. They really like to list members of things and say this one is the French, the Italian, the German, and so on. So what they did not like, what many of them did not like, was extreme nationalism, one that would endanger international peace or would not then participate to this kind of thing. But they weren't averse to nationalism per se. Now, in terms of emotions, some thought that healthy competition was good, right? So the kind of rush that one gets from confronting one another even in a competitive fashion, could be positive. And an easy example for this is the Olympic movement, right? The whole idea of having a competition that would still be peaceful, but competition nonetheless. Others, like the UIA, right? The International Mountaineering and Climbing Federation I discuss in the book, still going strong today. You probably know it if you're a climber. In the interwar period, they disagreed in that sense with the International Olympic movement, and instead they discouraged the practice of giving medals to members of a particular nation because they felt that the very notion of competition and giving a prize to one and not to the other could endanger the larger project of fostering friendship among people. So in general, most internationalists, and certainly the ones who dominated at the League of Nations, prefer what today historians of emotion might call a milder emotional style. They rejected the strong emotion of fascist and Nazi movement, the strong pride and so on, in favor of a version of internationalism that allowed for nations but to interact with one another in some kind of a benevolent way.
Yeah, I thought this was really interesting in your book, the way that these inciting very strong emotions was like pride and so on, as you're talking about, was not seen as a good thing. But also the internationalists were also concerned not to be seen as touting a sort of one-worldism. How in the end did their way of seeing emotions result in being seen as weak?
So yes, in the book I argue that this choice of mild emotional style did result in looking weak. And I started thinking about it that way by looking actually at contemporary arguments, people at the time already saying the same thing. And, one of my own strong emotional experiences at the League of Nations archives in Geneva was to really get a sense of their voice, their presence, this party arguing that, was when I opened these boxes filled with requests for a League of Nations anthem. People took the time to compose them, to mail them out. They begged for a flag around which to feel. Many took the time to design models, to stitch them by hand, to send them over. And there's something about going there and finding them folded and touching them. But they were never adopted. And this choice at the time was justified by saying that if they did adopt that, then people would complain about what, here comes the super state, and then they would be alienated from the League. They would, individual nations would feel that the League was trying to impose on them in ways that they never agreed to. And yet, many people argued then, and I actually argue as well, based though not particularly on their point of view, but on the analysis of emotion that and the moral economy of the time, this choice did result in an overall cold and distant style that ultimately contributed to the League becoming stereotyped as, again, distant in a negative sense, far away from what would call, the gritty, real challenges of the tough life. And in a way, he lost trust. He lost credibility in being able to actually engage with the nitty-gritty and the real and engage in the strong passions of the time, if you will, perhaps by trying to be too reasonable at time and too calming in the face of very violent and strong passions coming from these extreme nationalist movements.
And dampening these emotions that are there. At the same time, it's full of emotions as you bring out. And, we're recording this podcast from the very imposing Palais des Nations in the Ariana Park with its sweeping lawns overlooking, going away, overlooking the Mont Blanc, that we can see on a clear day, as you point out also in your book. And it's really no accident that these internationalist emotions sort of find their home in the Alps. Almost like the scenery, the mountains embody this spirit. And they saw the landscape as a real place of inspiration. And it's during this interwar period also that the Swiss writer, Robert de Traz, wrote his book with a title that famously summed up the sentiment as L'Esprit de Genève, Spirit of Geneva. So briefly, tell us how internationalist emotions were tied into a myth around Geneva and how these emotions linked to the mountains were used also to argue for the seat of the League being in Geneva.
Well, internationalists of all types seem to love mountains. Many of them like to climb them. They like to hike them. They set events in mountain regions, the Alps in particular. They painted them. They photographed them. They invented them in a way as a preferred site. They ate mountain foods. They made up some of them, like the fondue that I have in the cover of my book. They enjoyed mountain music, and they labeled certain music and mountain music. And I was really struck by this element. And in the book, then I decided really to historicize this and to see how we could actually go back and see how different groups were able to take older notions of the sublime, right? Those 19th century version of the sublime attached to the mountains, and then retranslate them after the First World War by really showing mountains as a site for noble endeavors and to adapt them then to their own internationalist causes, whatever this may be. And I think it's important to remember it was not only the extreme nationalists that did this. There is good literature on them doing this, but the internationalists did that too. And so when it comes to Geneva, now, of course, the site was not chosen because of the mountains, but it was chosen for a number of other reasons. But it is relevant that as soon as it was chosen, its proximity to the Alps was often emphasized, sometimes exaggerated, and building on these motifs that I just described. It was then frequently associated with its goals of fostering security and friendship among nations, sometimes by hiking, climbing, eating the fondue, or doing any of these quintessential mountain activities.
Which we still do now, of course.
Yes.
The Palais des Nations was planned in the late 20s and built in the 30s, of course. And in your book, you call it the greatest artifact of the League of Nations. What do you see in the architects' illustrations of their proposals for the building? You've already touched slightly on this.
And so this was another lovely bit of archival research at the League of Nations archives, because these plans are still there. They come in these big albums, and one opens them up and they see them. And there was this big competition for the design of a new building. Hundreds of entries are still preserved there, and many featured mountains. Often, I found it striking, exaggerated in terms of size or shape. And they thought of this really futuristic buildings that were really designed trying to maximize the mountain exposure, to make people look at mountains in all different ways. There was one in the middle of a lake, on the lake. So they had all sorts of ways to fantasize about what this site would look like in light of the mountains surrounded above below. So the winning design was actually not from that competition. It came later. But it also, in the end, featured a large gallery overlooking the Alps. It's still there. And I did find the rationale for it, which I quote in the book. And that was so that the delegates coming out of their deliberations could be inspired by the scenery and once again feel that togetherness that all those mountain activities and associations evoke.
Well, it still remains very impressive.
Mm-hmm.
The way that you have written your book is really very well constructed. You describe your book as moving from the hub of the League of Nations outwards to discuss the connections with these different organizations and institutions and networks that hovered around it, or, often trying to look very international. So starting with the League, would you tell us a bit how, from its functionalist approach, the League came to see the importance of intellectual cooperation and how it might lead to a League of Minds?
Yeah, I remember when I was researching the book and writing it, in organizing my notes, I had a folder that was called the League's Halo. I thought of it as the League's Halo, all of this ring of organizations and people that somewhat either emanated out of the League or somehow seemed together towards it in one way or another. Now, in terms of the League of Minds, the League unapologetically followed a top-down approach. They charged intellectuals, as they called them at the time, with the task and the responsibility of educating public opinion and of helping to foster a culture of peace. And major figures of the time, from Albert Einstein to Marie Curie and many others, were involved. And so intellectual cooperation, as it was called, became one of the League's leading branches. And then in 1926, a separate institute was started in Paris, and this later became UNESCO, and it still exists, of course. I think it's striking how they laid the foundation for anything from interlibrary loan initiative to student and faculty exchanges. But the one thing that somehow we have lost is the idea of the intellectual. And it's probably because, later on, there was a whole critique in regard to the term intellectual, at the very notion of the intellectual. It seemed top down in a negative way. There seemed to be this idea that the intellectual was this person distant from reality, a bit like the, stereotype version of the Palais des Nations that seemed too elitist for the late 20th century and early 21st century world. But sometimes I find myself thinking, if we were to strip that away and go back to the original idea that somebody who took the time to study and to learn about something and to accumulate a knowledge, perhaps there is a responsibility there to share that knowledge, right? And to educate each other on our own field of expertise, to try to create a more informed public opinion. I found that quite vivid and striking and relevant to this day. But that was kind of the idea then that drove many of these initiatives.
You bring this up really well in your book. But let's perhaps move up to the mountains. And in your book, you invite us actually to put on our boots and go. So let's go ahead. This is really the arena in which these internationalist practices could play out on a sort of ideal backdrop. And you mentioned that sometimes they talked about creating notre paix là-haut, our peace up high. But first of all, as an aside almost, what did the Catholic Pope have to do with this?
The Catholic Pope, Achille Ratti, Pope Pius XI, avid climber in his youth. And he wrote about the mountains, and I quite enjoy actually reading his writing and then citing them and trying to place them in a broader really environment milieu at the time of different novels that describe the Alps in similar ways. And once he became Pope, he proclaimed Bernard of Menton patron saint of people who either inhabited mountains or visited them or climbed them, somehow made them holy as a whole, as a site. And then he very much became part of the larger movement connecting mountains and internationalism that I described earlier.
That's fascinating. So, but everybody is not a mountaineer. Tell us more about tell us more about how these keen alpinists brought the experience of the emotions that they felt up there in the mountains down from the mountains to the public through art and photography.
Yeah, and it's funny, these terms, right? Mountaineer, the montagnard, in French, and there are all sorts of alpinistes. I think it's useful to clarify some of their use because they could get quite messy and they were not always used consistently. So in the book, I talked about various groups as they were understood then and sometimes idealized in the time I examined. So one group were the people from the mountains. They sometimes refer to as the montagnards. And that I would qualify for because I come from the other side of the Alps, so towards the Italian side. I could probably pass as a montagnard. And these were often portrayed in film and literature in contradicting ways. Film there was a bit early. Well, they start in film at the time, but even earlier with novels and in literature, they were often portrayed in contradicting ways. Either very healthy and very happy, I think of Heidi, or as this quasi-monstrous, disproportionately affected by diseases such as cretinism, thyroidism, and all sorts. And often stereotyped as quite grumpy on one side, but also very authentic and honest, matter of fact, salt of the earth kind of type. So internationalists adapted the stereotypical representation of these groups to argue that then mountains would be ideal sites for cooperation, either because they made people happy, Heidi-like, friendly, or because they would lead to this authentic relationship that the grumpy montagnard could have handled. Then there were the alpinists, right? The climbers. That's the category I cannot quite claim any ownership to. And they too, though, became essentialized as strong, ready to help each other. Many of them were active in international organizations such as the UIA I mentioned earlier, and they did engage in international activities, such as standardizing maps, creating coordinated responses to avalanches and all these kind of things, very much responding to the League of Nations prompt to standardize in different fields. And here, though, too, it's important to remember that many of their activities targeted an even broader public. This is not the story about a few people, They had activities for what they call bon marcheurs, the good walkers, who could just, maybe meet each other on a Sunday walk and go for a short hike. But they would also reach out to how many children going there on summer camp or, for a hike on a Sunday. I did that as a girl. There was still this idea that, children can become friends by joining some kind of youth club and doing these kind of activities. And then, of course, patients of all types. They could go there to treat diseases such as tuberculosis, for instance, which I talk about. And so all of these categories really connected to one another and then led very much to broadening these ideas and these practices, not just to a small group of climbers or the small number of people living on the mountains proper, but a much broader public. And then again, the art, photography, and all of these different initiatives, movies and novels that then really became quite dominant in terms of culture in this period.
Absolutely. I think you even mentioned specifically the number of movies that came out with mountains as a big theme in them. I think it was even 855 in that interwar period. So it's an enormous amount of films.
I do remember triple checking every number. I was very grateful that there are wonderful databases now available, and there was this beautiful collection of posters that was made available, if I recall, by the museum in Turin for alpinism and others. And I put together all these things and then ran the numbers and started counting. I actually went to the poster and counted how many of them feature particular themes, and it was quite dominant and quite understudying. I think most people tend to think about the Berg film and Krakauer study of the Nazi appropriation of the mountain imagery in this period, which indeed existed. I'm not necessarily contradicting. I'm just contextualizing as part of a broader appropriation of the mountain that was done by different groups, not just by Nazis or extreme fascist groups.
Well, let's move a little from the groups and internationalists as a whole and talk about specific individuals who were some of these internationalists, to look at a couple of doctors who were working up in the Alps, not too far from Geneva, because the mountains offered this sort of place of peace and a place of healing. And you've talked about patients also up in the mountains. And in your book, you write about the small mountain village of Les-Uns in the canton of Valais. It's about 120 kilometers from Geneva. And it was a sort of almost thriving hub of internationalism. What is this link between the League of Nations and internationalization of the Alps?
Yeah, so following the League, many internationalist groups started to organize activities on the Alps. And conversely, people in institutions that were already there for different reasons ended up aligning or associating their activities with the League. And so I see this kind of circular process. And the medical institutions in Les-Uns that I discussed in my book belong for the most part to the second group. So they were already there because the sanatoria had already been built since the late 19th century because of this village particular position and microclimate. So the reason why they were there was not necessarily because of their proximity to Geneva, but by the time we get to the interwar period, we really see how they try to align their activities with the League of Nations and very much emphasize this proximity, both geographical and also ideological.
And so your book is beautifully illustrated with some wonderful photos of children very aesthetically posed in summer meadows on snowy slopes and of naked sunbathing patients working in the fresh alpine air and some strategically placed flower pots occasionally. But these surprising photos lead us to one of the internationalists you mentioned in your book. Would you tell us a bit more about Dr. Rollier and the impact of his work?
Yes, Dr. Auguste Rollier, also known as the Sun Doctor. And by the way, I owe to his one of his relatives, one of his descendants, the courtesy of allowing me the rights to publish some of these photographs. And thanks to his family, they were able to enjoy them and to publish them. I was quite grateful. So the Sun Doctor, starting from 1903, pioneered and practiced what was known as heliotherapy, the sun cure, the sun treatment, following the principle that controlled exposure to the sun could help with the treatment of tuberculosis. And, before antibiotics, options were limited, and this was kind of the one of the few available treatments. Now, patients were not completely naked. In fact, children in particular wore the famous culotte Rollier, an undergarment especially designed to maximize exposure while preserving modesty. Now, by 1930, that Rollier alone ran 37 clinics with more than 1,100 patients. And not all of these patients were wealthy. He had some clinics for well-to-do people who really expected, a nice treatment and beautiful lodgings, but he also had establishments for people of all different classes and walks of life. He designed a special bed, le lit Rollier, for workers so that the lathes and other machines could be literally attached to the bed. And that way they could continue to work and keep busy, continuing to earn, avoiding depression. That was a big part. He really connected the physical well-being with the mental one. And also to become friends with patients from other countries while undergoing lengthy treatments, sometimes for months, for years. And so in his mind, during these long stays, putting together all these different bits, he wouldn't just be healing individuals, he would be really healing the world and providing the foundation then to build a lasting peace. And that peace would start with an emotional peace that the Alps would be especially conducive to.
And the building still exists.
And the building, so of some of them do, some of them do not. But I do recall quite evocative actually going into one, and it was still there, and I could see very much those very balconies and those very details whose design he had minded so carefully.
And there was another very renowned doctor and internationalist, Dr. Vautier, who also practiced in Lausanne at the time. And we may not have heard of him, but as you write in your book, he was in fact nominated several times for the Nobel Peace Prize. And at Dr. Vautier's university sanatorium, it was, as you mentioned, the emotional and physical and intellectual and social needs of people suffering from tuberculosis were very carefully and individually prescribed. You talked about the exposure to sun, but there were very specific timetables about how this should be done and what exposure at what time of the day and so on. It's very, very detailed. But this was all very carefully catered for. And, in these post-COVID lockdown times, the cover photo on your book perhaps might make us cringe because it's a group of happy patients in the sanatorium all dipping into a cheese fondue together. But there was a real firm belief in these practices as generating international fellowship and fraternity and harmony, and that it would, as you said, sort of extend out beyond these individuals, beyond these patients and the hospital communities and so on, much further across the world. Could you explain to us just a little bit more about the hopes for and impact of this Swiss-managed international university sanatorium?
Yeah, so the picture you see on the cover is actually the colorized version of a glass slide I found at the archive. I was quite pleased when then the UP, they were able to colorize it and really make it alive. They seem like they're actually moving. And these were students and faculty who were affected, university students and faculty who were affected with tuberculosis, and at this particular sanatorium could continue their academic activities. And so Dr. Vautier carefully crafted every aspect of their experience, from daily schedules to activities, and each one of them contributed to the medical, emotional, and political internationalist objective of the establishments. And one of them, indeed, was eating fondue. And so this idea of sharing food together, and he especially minded the design of each room. And if you can stare at the picture for a long time, and then you realize every single detail. They're patients, but they're not wearing pajamas; they're wearing regular clothes. And each room was designed ever so carefully. And whenever somebody tried to change it, you would always have a rationale why, this should or should not happen, depending on the effect that this would have. So an extremely careful man. And on one hand, this picture might look dated, right? It might look like a world from a long time ago. And yet, there's a part of me that thinks it really does not. Because if we think about just advertisements for study abroad program, just to come up with an easy example, or some of these brochures for corporate team buildings activities, or nowadays websites and all these things, right? In many ways, try to replicate that kind of aesthetic, right? It's all about the atmosphere, people happy doing things together. Even when we think about attempts at assessing or identifying the user's experience, all of these ways in which these things now are broken up and counted and quantified and assessed in all the different, sometimes Big Brother ways, Orwellian ways. In many ways, they go back to these very notions that deepen their roots in the 1920s and in these very initiatives, right? That atmospheres do matter, and it is about particular colors and feels and textures and excitements and indeed foods and everything else. And of course, that picture is staged. We know it was staged, but all of the advertisements we look at are staged too. And so I think that continuity too can be useful to explore.
But at the sanatorium, at the end of this interwar period, the Second World War was drawing much closer, and the emotions started perhaps to be linked to nationalism much more clearly. How did this play out at this university sanatorium? And would you expand a little on how feelings evoked by the Alpine settings are used for different agendas?
Yeah, and here is where it gets messy, right? So as I mentioned earlier, many internationalists were not necessarily against nationalism, and many nationalists were also internationalists. So that's one thing, right? So we don't want to see nationalism and internationalism as two things that are opposed to one another. But then, of course, there were extreme nationalists, right? The ones that wouldn't, in principle, necessarily be associated in our mind with internationalism. And yet, as soon as we start looking at internationalism as a practice, then we find out that there was such a thing as a group of fascist internationalists that were trying to connect across borders to link with other fascists. And there were also many extreme nationalist groups that kept their engagements in non-fascist organizations or in internationalist organizations, even after the countries that they belonged to had already left the League of Nations, for instance, or even when their ideologies were completely at odds. And so I think this continuity of practice, despite the ideological difference or the rhetoric in these incongruences, these contradictions, are some of the most interesting to really identify, to really explore. And so then to really dig deep into why is it that they continue to be involved, that's again, it's a messy story. In some cases, it also seems, a bit nefarious because, under alpinistic friendship, one could hide all matters of sin, all sorts of questionable associations. On the other hand, people were people, and sometimes they had alpinistic friendships, and they continue their relationship with them the same ways in which some of us might continue a relationship with friends or family members that we feel strongly at odds with politically. And so it's a fascinating, I think, microcosm through which one can analyze all sorts of deep and extremely relevant questions about what it means to think something, to do something, to associate it with people, to live life in times that are emotionally and politically charged.
So your book focuses on the time of the League of Nations, but as the United Nations emerged after the Second World War, do you think there was a shift in emphasis of emotions linked with the new organization?
Well, there were certainly shifts in emphasis, and many things did change after 1945, but I think in my book, in the end, I emphasize continuities more than I emphasize breaks. And that's probably in reaction to the fact that historiographically we have not been doing so. Traditionally we tend to really see this big moment there, which is the Second World War, and there's this big wall that we tend to build, and everything that happened before then seemed to be part of a completely different era. And I didn't see that while doing this research. I think that the interwar emphasis on, again, emotions, atmosphere, and these practices that I'm describing, if forgotten for a time, continued, however, in different forms. And I'm thinking not just about the League of Nations and the UN, but also about cultural diplomacy, all of these programs aimed at winning hearts and minds in different settings. There's a good literature in the US on this. And this whole trust in-person encounters, building sentimental paths during the Cold War. All of these things originated very much in the 20s and the 30s, and in the places that I describe here. So, I think it's important, well, first of all, not to stereotype internationalism is necessarily good or happy or benevolent at all times, no more than we do with any other political movement or ideological movement or a community of practice. But also not to see that separate from the globalized world that developed after 1945, which also has elements that one can construe as benevolent, as positive, and, leading to peace, but also others that clearly are not. And that's why our moments right now is so difficult. And the very tension, the coexistence of these conflicting poles is something that I think we could really benefit from seeing on the long durée, really seeing how this has been playing out over a long period of time, rather than just cutting the roots short in 1945.
The continuity. So we're drawing to a close with this episode, but do you find that having researched emotions in history, you have become much more aware of the way in which we use emotions today in the international arena? And if so, what do you see?
Well, looking, I'm not sure I can offer solutions, but certainly I do think that looking at emotions does make one just, like you said, more aware, just noting perhaps things that otherwise one wouldn't. So I do believe that today, as back then, one of the great challenges is that what people feel seems to drive their actions sometimes more than what they know. And so these collective notions of anger, of pride, but also empathy or solidarity, they don't have to be good or bad, but they seem to affect people's behavior in important ways, not only when they vote, but also when they decide to support particular causes or not. And these communities of feeling, these emotional communities, so to speak, seem to regard knowledge, fact, less than this immediacy of feeling. And I think that there's something to be said about looking at the history of that. Now, I was struck by how people in the 1920s had already identified this dynamic, in how they saw it then as a priority to try to manage these emotions accordingly. They thought, if people are going to act according to emotion, if they're going to kill each other following these strong feelings, or then healing is going to have to come from there too. And so they really thought that something needed to be done in order to control these feelings out of hand, as I was mentioning at the beginning. And I think they had identified the media as one of the most important battlegrounds for that. They lived at a time when radio was becoming more and more important. Visual media was really emerging. And, intellectual cooperation, these committees, they really put a lot of effort trying to control educational materials, the kind of images put out there. You mentioned the photographs, the amount of photographs they produce and how carefully they stage them, because they really believed that being mindful about the visual messages that one sent it out and controlling those and using those was really of the essence. And I wonder if perhaps we need to go back to that. We need to have a public discussion about how we want to discipline in a way that is not oppressive, but how do we want to regulate this? How do we want to handle, manage? We can use whatever term we want, but how are we going to deal with the reality that these currents are at work? And if we want to survive as a community, as a community of human beings, we need to get a grip and find a way to handle this together.
So what would you like our listeners to take away from this conversation? I was wondering what message, what image, or perhaps what even emotion would you like to leave us with?
Well, I guess, first, if by any chance any of the listeners ever thought that perhaps emotions, are interesting but somewhat decorative or fluffy, or at odds with what one would call proper good history, or maybe too hard to study or too impossible to get a hold of intellectually, let's set that aside. And, and instead, I really would I hope that my legacy as a historian, my work will perhaps help the process of embracing the fact that in the end there is a long history of people individually and in groups feeling emotions, worrying about them, modifying their behavior accordingly, and trying to make others feel one way or another. We do that in our personal lives, we do that socially, we do that politically, internationally. And so let's dare to use our hearts and brains to make sense of it the best we can. Let's perhaps resurrect the intellectual bit, right? Instead of looking at it as a bad word, let's broaden paths to education so that it's not an elitist thing, but let's hold discussions within and outside of the academy about how we can make sense of what we feel, of how we make other people feel, of the forces that push us to feel one way or another, especially in this age of mass media, social media, AI, and all these scary things, and perhaps what we can do together across borders to make a better world, whatever our alpine trek is, whatever our chosen peak to climb might be, so that we can make each other's life just a bit better and do our bit to improve our world. And that's in the end the biggest lesson I got from this time, that many people seem to have this sense of duty. We got to do our bit. So if I can do my bit and inspire others to do the same and to do that through emotions, then that would be, I think, something would give me a lot of joy at least.
What a wonderful way to end this episode. Dr. Scaglia, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It was a true pleasure. Thank you very much.